Okay. Hello, everyone. We are waiting for folks to get in. We will hit our cues, and when we're ready to go, just shortly. Just giving a little time for everybody to get in the room. Hi, Lisa. Okay. So we want to welcome everyone here. Thank you for being here. My name is Kevin Winstead. I am the postdoc to the Project on Rhetorics, Equity, Access, Computation, and Humanities Lab. We affectionately call PREACH, RIP Young Dolph. We want to welcome you to the Disco Network Graduate Scholars Lightning Talk, which is part of the Disco Network Lecture Series presented by the network and the Digital Studies Institute at the University of Michigan. Today, we are blessed to be with 5 brilliant scholars, starting with Brianna Barner, Raquel Escobar, Kyle Lindsay, Diana Zhu, and Josie Williams. We will begin shortly, as again, we're still waiting for folks to get in the room. But in the meantime, if you have any access or technology-related concerns or questions, please send those concerns to the Q&A section to our admin, Evan. If you have any questions related to the talks, you can also present them in the Q&A box as well, and we will turn those questions around as time allows. We ask that everyone respect our panelists' privacy, so there will be no recording, and we're asking for no live tweeting, as this is a closed session. So we recognize that not everyone knows what the Disco Network is. The Disco Network stands for Digital Inquiry, Speculation, Collaboration, Optimism Network. The Disco Network integrates critical, humanistic, social science, and artistic approaches to digital studies and foregrounds questions about the cultural implications of technology to envision a new anti-racist and anti-ableist digital future. The Disco Network is generously funded by the Andrew Mellon Foundation. I would like to present to you our collection of brilliant co-PIs. First, the principal investigator for this is our own Lisa Nakamura. And as co-PIs, we have Ray Fouché, Stephanie Dinkins, Remy Yurgo, Andre Brock, and Catherine Knight Steele. We would love to stay in contact with you all, particularly around our events. As such, we ask that if you're interested in our events, to join us at disconetwork.org/disco-events. Again, that is disconetwork.org/disco-events. And we've had many people ask us, well, just how do we get involved with the Disco Network? Well, there's 2 primary ways. You could become a Disco Network member, which is open to anyone who wishes to receive our newsletter, invitations to public events, and learn about opportunities to participate in collective research working groups and projects as well. And then there's also our DISCO Research Affiliate, which is also open to anyone who wishes to be more deeply involved in the network. You can apply for an individual or institutional affiliation. To do so, we ask that you go to disconetwork.org/become-a-member. Now, let me introduce you to our scholars. First up, we will have Dr. Brianna Barner, who is a President's Postdoctoral Fellow in the Department of Communication at the University of Maryland, my alma mater. She is an interdisciplinary critical and cultural communication scholar with research interests in Black podcasts, digital and Black feminism, digital media, social media as a tool for social justice and activism, and the representation of marginalized people, specifically Black girls and women, in popular culture and media. Brianna is a proud native of the South Side of Chicago, an alumni of Bennett College, a small women's HBCU in Greensboro, North Carolina. I should also say that she is someone that I just met through the Society for Media, SCMS, and I'm also a fellow Chicago partner, so she has a special place in my heart. Next up, we will have Raquel Escobar, who is a second-year PhD student in the Joint Program in English and Women's and Gender Studies at the University of Michigan. Their research interests includes feminist disability studies, queer crip time, comic studies, biodata, and digital health tools, and speculative embodiment. Their current involvement in the collaborative research project, Dancing and Writing Disability Differently, Non-Realist Embodiment and the Speculative Imagination, led by Petra Kuppers and Charlie Brissy, intertwines with their work as a member of the Digital Accessible Futures Lab. Then we will have Kyle Lindsay, who is a PhD candidate in American culture with a certificate in digital studies from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. His research explores how Black women and queer content creators buffer both bad faith and violent engagements online to produce viable, intellectual, and intimate digital communities. Lindsay is the co-author of Racist Zoom Bombing, a monograph co-authored with our own Lisa Nakamura and Hannah Steverson, and serves as co-coordinator of the Digital Inequality Lab. Lindsay was a Mellon Mays undergraduate fellow at Grinnell College, where he received his BA in Gender and Women's and Sexuality Studies. Then we will have Diana Mulan-Zhu, who's a second-generation Chinese-American artist, visual activist, filmmaker, technologist, and scholar living with bipolar disorder who seeks to understand shame, the body, sanity, and the digital gaze through painting, video art, performance, and installation. She grew up in the Pacific Northwest and studied computer science and studio art at Vanderbilt University. She currently is pursuing her MFA in art at SUNY Stony Brook University. In her practice, she draws on motifs of the diary, fairy tales, pornography, and social media to critique the violation and fetishization of the mentally ill Asian woman's body. And bringing us home, we will have Josie Williams, who's an Afro-Nowist, creative technologist, and founder of Algorithmic Equity, an interactive digital platform that empowers any New Yorker to report, record, or respond to law enforcement behavior. She has presented her research on bias and chronic kidney disease prediction modeling at NeurIPS Fair Health and ML Workshop in Vancouver and NYC Media Labs Summit in 2019. Currently, she is an MFA at Stony Brook University in the Future History Studio, participating in research fellowship with Stephanie Dinkins. Her primary interests revolve around artificial intelligence, data equity, cultivating Black radical imagination, and creating sentient-centered AI. As we transition into our panelists, I would like to introduce you all to Dr. Brianna Barner.
Thank you. Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. Again, my name is Dr. Brianna Barner, and today I'm going to be talking to you all about my favorite topic, which are Black podcasts. Next slide, please. Okay. When I first started researching Black podcasts back in 2016, we were 2 years out from the so-called podcast renaissance that began with the smash success of NPR's true crime podcast, Serial. This was still during the time when it was assumed that Black people didn't listen to podcasts. This was also during the time that it was assumed that Black people weren't creating podcasts as well. Next slide. We knew then, just like we know now, that this was not true. In fact, there were many Black podcasts that were created before Serial, such as This Week in Blackness, Tea with Queen and Jay, and The Combat Jack Show, all created during or before Serial's 2014 debut. Before Black podcasts, there was also Black blog radio. So in other words, we've been doing this work, being creative and creating engaging and competitive and competitive audio-based work for some time now. Next slide, please. My research questions have shifted tremendously now as the podcast landscape has changed so much. Black podcast listenership, along with that of Asian American and Latinx listenership, has continued to increase over the years and is set to surpass white groups. So in other words, listeners of color will become the dominant listenership, and this is expected to continue increasing, which will also significantly shift the podcast industry as a whole, presumably. Recognizing this, podcast companies and legacy media alike have invested heavily in creating pathways to provide resources for more podcast hosts who hold marginalized identities, such as fellowship programs for women of color. Next slide, please. So with all of that, my initial research question of what is a Black podcast has now shifted to what does a Black podcast do? What is its function? How indeed does it differ from other kinds of podcasts? It is important to note that also that obviously Black podcasts, like Blackness itself, are not a monolithic group. Sarah Florini's groundbreaking Black podcast research noted that many Black podcasts sound different from what at the time we would consider to be mainstream white podcasts that dominated the podcast airwaves. But as the podcast industry continues to mature, so has the plethora and spectrum of Black podcasts. Although that is not the scope of this research, I am interested in thinking through how Black podcasts have blended so many different genres of podcasts, such as more narrative storytelling to fictionalized scripted podcast shows. Next slide, please. Returning back to my new question, what does the Black podcast do? I am interested in thinking about the functions of Black podcasts and how hosts use their shows in creative and specific ways that are steeped in Black cultural specificity. To borrow from Seward Hall's infamous question, what is this Black and Black podcasting, and what is the utility in exploring this question during this particular cultural moment, especially as the podcast industry continues to professionalize and mature? I used Moya Bailey's concept of digital alchemy to explore the ways that Black podcasts intervene in oppressive media systems to imagine new possibilities for and reframing of representations of those whose identities lie, quote, at the margins of the margins. Next slide, please. Alchemy, Bailey writes, is, quote, the science of turning regular metals into gold, end quote. Digital alchemy then is, quote, the ways that women of color, Black women, and Black non-binary, agender, and gender variant folks in particular transform everyday digital media into valuable social justice media that recode the field scripts that negatively impact their lives, end quote. Thinking through the utility of the Black and Black podcast speaks to the ways that marginalized folks create podcasts that center the margins of the margin, while also using a platform to create different sounds and formats steeped in Black cultures and aesthetics. I do not insist that all Black podcasts do this, but instead consider the larger implications for the audiences, creators, and industry at large of the podcasts that do. Next slide, please. Today, I'll focus on the organization Grow Trek and their Black History Bootcamp podcast. The podcast is labeled as a walking podcast. This is not the first podcast to distinguish itself as such. Technically, all podcasts can be walking podcasts if the listener or host walks while listening to and or recording them. But where the Black History Bootcamp podcast differentiates itself is that it is the first walking podcast specifically centering and intended for Black women. The podcast was created by Girl Trek's founders in 2020 during the pandemic to help build community during the isolating periods of the pandemic. Girl Trek, as an organization, was founded to combat many of the health disparities that plague Black women, while also addressing the systemic issues that heighten those disparities. The organization encourages Black women to walk, and more importantly, to walk in community with other Black women and girls. The episodes of the podcast, called Walking Meditations, are usually around 30 minutes and are intended to be listened to while walking for the recommended daily time length of the same amount. The episodes center on various Black cultural issues, such as Black authors and even the history of significant Black neighborhoods across the country, encouraging listeners to get out and walk in their own neighborhoods together. The episodes are recorded conference calls that anyone around the globe can dial into. Because of the required social distancing of the pandemic to prevent the spread of COVID-19, which Black communities were disproportionately being affected by, walking outside was an activity that could be done safely together or even apart, as listeners could schedule times to walk together at the same time and listen to the episodes for community and accountability. In presenting this new format, the podcast models the intentionality in building and sustaining a digital community for Black women while also sharing little-known stories about Black culture not featured within mainstream media. Next slide, please. This podcast practices generative digital alchemy by, quote, creating new media that appeals to the community from which they come, end quote. The Black History Bootcamp podcast reframed narratives of community and physical health for Black women and Black communities across the country. The hosts themselves, 2 Black women, participated in these walking meditations and often discussed the importance that the episodes held for their own accountability and commitment to improving both their physical and mental health during the global pandemic. They did not record these podcasts with the intent to shame Black women or perpetuate notions of lack within Black neighborhoods. Instead, they empowered Black women to create communities of walkers within their own neighborhood to not only walk, but to discuss further the topics of the episodes, which legitimized many of these lesser known but critical pieces of Black history. In turn, these episodes provided education that can be shared with many and listened to whether one is walking or not. Next slide. To conclude, the function of this particular Black podcast was a focus on community and storytelling, while also shifting narratives around Black women's health. In creating a podcast that encouraged Black women to walk and gave them powerful and compelling audio that centered them and provided a balm during crisis, the Girl Trek founders formed a listening community of Black women that resonated both online and offline, taking Black girl magic and putting a unique spin on it. Thank you.
Rihanna, thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
Because you're at my alma mater and you're from Chicago, I'm always gonna, celebrate you to the point of embarrassment. Next up, we will have Raquel Escobar.
Hello, I'm just going to share my screen real quick here. Okay. Let's see. Okay, hello everybody. I'm going to be telling you about the project I've been working on with Dr. Remy Ergo. It's called One Log Entry at a Time, Constructing and Treating the Eating Disordered Self. Throughout this presentation, I'm going to refer to eating disorders as EDs, recovery record as RR, I'll explain what that is in a second, and cognitive behavioral therapy as CBT for the sake of time. So Recovery Record is an app designed to help reduce its users' eating disorder symptoms through a cognitive behavioral therapy short-term self-monitoring practice. RR is privately funded, and it was created by the former director of mobile engineering at Walmart, Stuart Argue, alongside Jenna Togarthran, who has developed a number of mental health and addiction-related apps in the past. Recovery Record is nested under the company called Bright Therapeutics that offers a suite of mental health, addiction, generally diet and eating related apps. And the main conceit behind Recovery Record is that they aim to improve upon the pen and paper self-monitoring implemented in traditional CBT-based ED treatment. to mitigate healthcare costs, and to quote Tregarthen, the co-founder, give users closure and affirmation when they confess their greatest fears and eating patterns that they are ashamed of. RR has been downloaded by over 1 million people, and it's one of the very few ED apps that have been scientifically evaluated. And as such, it's a significant site for questions surrounding those who have EDs and seek treatment through automated therapy in the contemporary moment. So RR operates primarily by way of routine user log entries. So I have screenshots up here of what those logs look like when you pull them up on the app. The logs prompt users to record meals and snacks, so what you eat, when and where you eat it, how you're feeling when you do so, etc. It's also important to note that on these log screens, the only social identity related question that R explicitly asks of its users is their gender. And this question appears at the end of every log. And so the idea here behind RR is that all you have to do to treat your ED is be left alone with the app, record your meals regularly, and by simply doing these routine log entries and interacting with yourself through this medium of the app, you can reduce your ED symptoms. And any involvement of a human treatment team, or like a triad, so a therapist / clinician plus the medium of communication plus the patient, in this process is purely elective and unnecessary to R's treatment model. You just need the app. And so in my project, I first examined how rhetoric and research surrounding recovery record and its log entry system construct the medium's role in a dyadic or two-participant automated therapy, with particular attention to how the app facilitates what Hannah Zeven calls in her history of automated therapy, auto-intimacy. And then with this portrait of what R is, how it works, what its goals are, I then illustrate the second participant in that dyad, which is recovery records users. And I do so through a feminist, disability, and fat studies-based analysis of ED identity formation at the site of each of those logs. And so my analysis, this dual-part analysis, reveals that the self who is recorded, reflected upon, known, and can therefore be treated for an eating disorder through recovery record is necessarily fixed and bounded by R's log entry system. So feminist disability studies and fat studies help me to demonstrate the centrality of gender in the study and treatment of, but also identification with EDs. And this theoretical foundation also helps me to approach and unpack the giant diagnostic category of EDs as a disability and to complicate understandings of EDs in the digital realm. So fat studies also in particular here helps me to highlight the intricacies of diet culture and anti-fatness in relation to EDs, RR, and identity formation in the context of neoliberalism and digital capitalism. So in addition to that sort of broad general theoretical foundation, I have screenshots here of 3 specific works that are very crucial to my project. So the first of those, Andre Brock's critical technocultural discourse analysis, which you can see on the right, or CTDA for short, involves not just a thorough analysis of R's meal logs and other app functions, but also, for example, attention to the ED research implicated in R's design, the push notifications it sends its users outside the app, the user data that R sells to outside parties, how R interacts with its users' digital selves more broadly, so like in advertisements or things like that, and also alternative and creative misuse of RR. So secondly, another specific work is Karen Barad's Getting Real, the techno-scientific practices and the materialization of reality. I use this work to show that as an apparatus, it interacts in Barad's terms with its user through its CBT-based meal logs and other functions. R helps produce and is part of the body it images. So RR is part and producer of the eating disordered body. People who seek ED treatment through RR are hailed into being or materialized as RR users, and therefore are material discursive bodies. And finally, I use Olivia Banner's communicative biocapitalism. It's crucial to my understanding of the digital self, monitoring, tracking, quantification at the heart of RR's treatment model. And I use this to color the digital health industry as a business and in which the RR user participates. So RR as a business, users' data as a product, and CBT as individualistic and highly suited to neoliberalism. And here's some of the things I analyzed beyond RR and its log interface or log entry system to give more context to the app. a lot about RR, like what it does with its users' data or what research went into building up the app, is publicly unavailable. So I turned to places like Bright Therapeutics, which I mentioned is the digital health company that owns Recovery Record along with other apps. And I look at different publications they put out about Recovery Record. Also, ED treatment apps, there are a number of them, and they exist in the sort of murky waters of the digital health industry where each ED treatment app exists or posits similar treatment aims backed by little, if any, research. And so I look at psychological research and practices for ED treatment more broadly to better understand what it means for R to treat people with EDs and for our users to have an ED, to get at what exactly that ideal or imagined portrait of the R user that R is built for. And the screenshots I have up here, so I forgot to mention earlier, this is the main page of Bright Therapeutics website, and this is a screenshot from the main questionnaire that is used in the intake and diagnosis of people with eating disorders in like a traditional in-person therapy. And so my present analysis deals primarily with gender, disability, and fatness, but I imagine it as a sort of stepping stone along to more substantive engagement with a myriad of other social identities like class, age, sexuality, etc. And I think it's that broader research is essential to understanding and supporting those with EDs beyond cursory references to differences or additive theories of social identity. And so, because my work will reflect these kind of wider questions, and I'm interested in what it means to seek ED treatment as a marginalized subject more generally, and how Recovery Record changes its users' relationships to their bodies and minds as they record lived ED experiences in-app, it leads me to along to some more broad questions speculating about things, for example, like digital phenotyping and how claims, predictions, and diagnoses are influenced by Recovery Record, how interacting with Recovery Record every time you eat might change your relationship to your body and your eating practices, and what exactly it means to recover from an eating disorder or with an app that relies on a continuous stream of user data to profit, and within a white supremacist, anti-fat, ableist diet culture more generally. So thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate the chance to share my work with y'all.
Diana, thanks so much for that. Your work is something that falls outside of my own research expertise, so it's an opportunity to learn. So thank you for that. Next up, we will have Kyle Lindsay. Kyle.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see everybody's names, and everybody's names and boxes are in the participant chat. So I'm excited to present my research with all of you. Let me get set up here. Okay. Raquel, can you see my screen okay? Perfect, thank you so much. I'd first like to thank Evan Hoy, Kristen Waterbury, Kevin Winstead, and Ann Feltz, as well as the other staff of DISCO for organizing this opportunity for us to share our research with you. As grad students at the University of Michigan and other peer institutions find themselves in the midst of work stoppages, it's ever relevant that we take stock in all the labor it takes to make university events like this one possible. So thank you once again to everybody here to helping make this possible. The work I'll be sharing with you all today are the ideas I've been ruminating on for my first chapter of my dissertation, in which I explore how Black YouTubers navigate the circulation of cancel culture on digital platforms and how their work to sift through the nebulous nature of the term highlights the impact of the audience and their attention. For the purpose of this talk, I'd like to spend my time talking about the very definitions and uses of the term cancel culture. Let's get started. Cancel culture is a term that's been circulating in the media landscape for the past few years. I'm certain many people watching are familiar with news stories of celebrities and other high-profile individuals supposedly ousted from public life by an angry mob over a small infraction. Typically how the story goes, right? However, something that I find rather interesting is that the wide circulation of the term has not translated into a common definition amongst everyone who is using it. Social scientists at the Pew Research Center conducted a study in 2020 and followed up on it in 2022 to understand how polled Americans across the political spectrum defined cancel culture. The most common definition given by those polled is that cancel culture serves as a system of accountability, meant to be in response to some transgression against a person or group in online space. This definition given by about 49% of those polled by the Research Center, and it also serves the universally given definition by those who self-identified as liberal or Democrat. This definition was also quite common amongst those who self-identify as conservative and Republican, but it was by no means a unanimous definition amongst those polled. Other definitions given by conservative or Republican respondents referred to cancel culture as censorship of speech or history, mean-spirited actions to cause someone harm, people canceling anyone they disagree with, and or an attack on traditional American society. There's a lot to be said about the variety of definitions given about cancel culture, right? From this set of definitions, we can presume the conservative and Republican respondents view cancel culture as an unnecessary process, a political strategy whose main goal seems to be to harass and censor individuals, a practice deployed to slander people that we disagree with. Not a great look, right? While there is an affective agreement amongst conservative and Republican respondents, the fact that there is not an agreed upon definition of the term amongst that group or amongst Americans widely polled raises some alarms. How can cancel culture be both a mode of accountability, but also be a phenomenon akin to censorship and an attack on American society? I argue that a key problem with cancel culture is the fact that not everyone's on the same page. This variety of definitions stifles the political potential of cancel culture as a term. A second key problem with cancel culture is that it might not actually exist, depending on who you ask. Black feminist thinkers who work in and study social media know that the only things that cancel culture really do is one, bastardize the modes of Black digital practice, and two, obfuscate the power dynamics present in online controversies. In her article, Drag Them, an etymology of so-called cancel culture, Meredith D. Clark, pictured on the left, argues that cancel culture serves as a way with those of influence in the public spheres to co-opt canceling, a mode of resistance deployed in Black queer digital spaces, and something that Andre Brock Jr. notes as having origins in signifying practices. Clark defines canceling, as, quote, an expression of agency, a choice to withdraw one's attention from someone or something whose values, inaction, or speech are so offensive, one no longer wishes to grace them with their presence, time, and money, unquote. This definition establishes canceling as a specific means of recourse taken on by an individual or a collective of people in online spaces for particular infractions, an appropriate response to an inappropriate action, right? This runs in contrast to indications to cancel culture, which often obfuscate the players, stakes, and power dynamics of a particular infraction, relying on nebulous retellings to garner sympathy. This investment in obfuscation is built upon by Wagwate Wanjuki, pictured on the right. Building on the suspicions articulated by Clark, Wanjuki argues that looking to people who are invested in cancel culture, how it's not real, is often, she might even argue exclusively, a tactic taken up by the powerful to uphold inequitable and violent systems of power. Wanjuki's example of this is a comedian, Sarah Silverman, who was removed from a film in 2019 after the resurfacing of a 2007 sketch of her in blackface. While Silverman does express regret and uneasiness over the sketch, and Wanjuki acknowledges the difficulty of repeated apology over this moment, Wanjuki also notes that Silverman gained quite a bit of media attention following this removal, right? Having profiles in publications like The Guardian and the LA Times. Silverman subsequently used these profiles to frame the accountability she was reckoning with as a mob engaging what she called righteousness porn, both invoking the mean-spirited action definition of cancel culture I mentioned earlier, and unintentionally erasing folks that might genuinely be upset with a white woman doing blackface, further putting the racism that she was engaging in on sort of the rhetorical back burner. Beginning to wrap up, my intervention in the scholarly conversation around cancel culture turns to how audiences utilize cancel culture in the YouTube space. The controversy I'm hoping to expand on in my chapter centers YouTuber Shane Dawson, who found himself in controversy in 2020 for previous YouTube content featuring him in blackface, saying the N-word, and sort of other racist content. A lot of black place around in media, more than I came to expect when I started doing this research. While it is seemingly a standard example of how many understand cancel culture, two things caught my eye about this particular story. One is that these infractions were previously brought on by Shane critiquing the dynamics of the One is that these infractions were previously brought up by Black YouTubers and bloggers back in 2014. Actually, this is not the first time this content has been recirculated. And secondly, this surfacing was brought on by Shane critiquing the dynamics of the YouTube makeup community, which he recently became a part of due to a collab with Shane Dawson, featured on the left with his mouth covered. Black YouTubers such as Cat Black have theorized that this reckoning with Shane Dawson's content lies not within the audience's offense to his content, but an attempt to delegitimize his claims against one of their favorite YouTubers, Jeffree Star. In her video on the subject, Be Honest, You Don't Care If They're Racist, which starts with this lovely quote I have on screen, Black signals that audiences were willing to sift through, watch, and repost racist content, thereby traumatizing themselves and Black people, creators and viewers alike on the platform, and contribute to a cycle of controversy, all for the sake of defending Jeffree Star, who has his own racist stuff to sort of answer for if anyone's familiar with him. So I end here to note that the focus on the audience as actors in the obfuscation caused by cancel culture, rather than merely receivers of rhetoric, highlights the rhetorical choice of YouTubers like Cat Black to request that audiences look inward and consider how much racist content they're willing to let themselves and others endure for the sake of enjoying their media consumption. Thanks so much for listening, everyone, and I look forward to your questions if you have any for me.
Oh, thank you for that. I really appreciate your citational practices. Introducing scholars in that manner is really, really important. Thank you. I want to take a time to just remind folks that they can put their questions to our scholars in the chat. And with that, I will introduce Diana Ju. Diana.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to share my screen. So, hello, I'm Diana Mullen-Ju. I'm a MFA art candidate at Stony Brook University, and I work with Stephanie Dinkins at the Future History Studio as a graduate assistant. And today, I'm going to really talk about how I use a hybrid theory making kind of scholar artist approach to research and knowledge making. I see my art practice as a embodied sort of putting my body in the stakes in order to kind of generate knowledge and do research. I work in painting, video, sculpture, installation, and performance art. And a lot of my work draws on personal narrative, family history, and experiences as an Asian American woman growing up in white suburban America. And I explore how racialized representations of sexuality continue to intervene on identity and citizenship in a technologically mediated world. I also began scholarly research in these topics, doing a master's at NYU in media culture and communications, where I focused using a feminist media studies and queer of color critique on revenge porn as a phenomenon to kind of understand violence, the body, and sexuality as it kind of expresses itself through the internet and networks. So looking at this kind of representation of revenge porn was kind of my first introduction to these themes about, the violence that can be done through simply supposedly immaterial image of your body. But meanwhile, I was also kind of trying to understand these questions in my art practice, and I began a series of paintings where I was creating these material objects, oil paintings that are kind of preemptively reclaiming agency by preemptively circulating the kind of nudes that might be, violently kind of circulated without consent. And I wanted to know, how does this material version or representation of a digital file circulate and make meaning in the world differently? So this is also my first kind of my beginning of my interest in shame, and also this kind of complicity or guilt for enacting a self-fetishization and this dialectic of both empowerment and marginalization. And for me, I also in this series began a signature method of layering. And I see layering as a reference to both the Photoshop layers that I use in Blend in creating the image, but also the screen as a layer, as a surface, and the canvas as a surface. And these are all kind of boundaries between so-called, binary worlds of the IRL world versus the digital world, or the IRL world and the painting kind of imaginary world. And I'm thinking about how do these, supposedly rigid or non-porous surfaces actually kind of create refractions of what it means to be a body and what it means to represent a body. My work is in a long kind of lineage and dialogue with a violent history in Western art of this kind of colonial gaze on an objectified feminine body. I draw on feminist film scholars like Laura Mulvey and art theorists like John Berger, who describe an inherently gendered power dynamic in looking and image making. I also bring in scholars like Legacy Russell, who kind of describes in their book Glitch Feminism the way that binaries are harmful in both thinking about gender as well as kind of digitality. And so pausing now to think about this series of paintings, that was really kind of thinking about violence and images when, a violence can be done to your body when it's on screen. But then I shifted my focus to looking at what happens and what kind of violences can be done to you by looking at images or looking at bodies. And the way that this began for me was started a painting triptych and of myself, self-portraits. And in looking back on these paintings after I completed them, it was kind of this radical moment of realizing, I painted these kind of semi-idealized, blown up faces of my own face. And it made me realize how, when I was a kid growing up in the 90s of white suburbia, I didn't really see faces like mine on movie posters, on magazine covers. And it also made me kind of go back to this kind of very traumatic, painful, shameful memory of the first time that I was exposed to an overrepresentation of Asian women. And when, as a preteen, I was shown, online porn for the first time by this classmate, and it was like, oh my God, look at this. I actually began really yearning to look at these images, and I'm making sense of it now as an adult. And I think it's because of the, lack or underrepresentation in other spaces. And I also wanted to think about how I began to worry or fret about what this distorted or warped kind of first idea of the Asian woman's body might have done to my, adult ongoing sense of myself and my body. And I'm also in dialogue with scholars who write about the inextricable link between sex work and the internet as we know it. So what I did was I took a video from archives of internet porn from my childhood era, 90s and early 2000s, and I collaged it into this experimental film to kind of represent the kind of chaotic barrage of images that I can kind of barely recall the specifics of. And then from there, I built a multimedia installation, which I got to exhibit in a gallery last April. And there are a lot of different components to this and I will play some clips from documentation of it. So first, I took that film that I made from collaging vintage porn, and I watched it in my studio, in my art studio on my laptop, and I'll turn that down. And then as I was watching it, I brought a bed into the studio. I watched it while sitting in bed, and I did a performance piece where I was binge eating Chinese American takeout. And this eating is meant to act as a proxy for the similarly shameful kind of coping mechanism of masturbation, but also the Chinese takeout is a stand-in for the kind of bastardized, Americanized, version of my culture that I could only have access to. I then installed the same bed and the same laptop in the gallery, and playing the video of my performance on the laptop, the same laptop that you see in the video. And then I finally projected a video of the collage film onto the bed. So here we can see, again, my interest in the idea of mediations of images of bodies, and the idea and kind of subverting the idea that there is somehow more realness or more originality in the phenomenological original object, but how does re-representing the body or re-representing the bed in a video of the bed, but then the literal bed, and how does this kind of refract new kinds of meanings? And I also kind of revisit this interest in surfaces, the literal surface of the folds of the sheet and the surface of the video screen. And after this installation, I still felt like very unsettled, like I hadn't fully made meaning out of this traumatic event. So I continued to reprocess, remediate, and I had taken photos of the bed before the performance, and I then rendered them in painting. And another thing about this kind of process of painting is that it's a cyclical, somewhat embodied kind of out of irrational process that is similar to the binge eating, which was also a cyclical kind of coping method. And by using my body, sitting through time and space, using my eyes and my hands to render this digital file, I was able to kind of try and make new understanding of this experience. I also took screenshots of the film, the collage film, and I painted them. And you'll notice I kept in the painting references to the play and pause interface that had appeared when I originally paused the film to screenshot it. And this is meant to create a push and pull in the gallery where you want to, your instinct is to touch the play button because we're so used to touch screens and devices and you want to scrub through the video, but then you are also pushed away because the cardinal rule of oil paintings in a gallery is you can't touch it. So I'm trying to suggest a haptic kind of materiality and subvert, again, this idea that the digital file and the analog oil painting are somehow totally disconnected. And then also something I tried to achieve or was able to achieve was kind of salvage a sense of dignity and agency for these porn actresses that could really only happen when I paused the video, which I already kind of created new cinematic visuality and kind of reincarnating her in a oil painting ultimately, I think, because, and this lends a sense of what some people see as ambivalence towards my kind of feeling about pornography as inherently violent or harmful. And here I draw on scholar Celine Perennis Shimizu's idea of hypersexuality of race, where there's a possibility for acknowledging both supposedly opposites, acknowledging both the pain and the violence of being hyper-fetishized, of this kind of being degraded, but also opening up space for joy and agency and even pleasure and admitting, I sometimes feel powerful when, despite being hypersexualized as an Asian woman. So I'll kind of conclude that I want to take this creative practice that I've done and shift over to a more scholarly approach and maybe trace a genealogy of the different paradigms in internet porn as we relate a phenomenological sense of the body to the kind of navigation schemes that have changed from, early internet Usenet forums to kind of microsites with very simple user architecture to, these tube sites with machine learning algorithms, and what are the kind of implications of this, metaphor of navigation, literally putting yourself through space, orienting yourself on the internet and in digital space, and how does that kind of render new ideas of the body? And that's it. Thank you.
Anna, thank you so much for that. As someone who does not have the kind of the mind for art in that way, I find that the explanations coming from artists and their work and how they're thinking is really generative for me. So I really appreciate that. To close us out, we will have Josie Williams, last but certainly not least. Josie.
Josie, you're muted.
Thank you for that. So yeah, I'm Josie Williams. I'm a creative technologist and digital artist, and I also work as a graduate assistant at the Future History Studio with Stephanie Dinkins. I wanted to talk about a recent and ongoing exploration I've been doing through my art practice, specifically an inquiry about technology that makes us more human. And when I say more human, I'm talking about technology and digital experiences that allow us to tap into the more intimate qualities of being human. So playfulness, joy, exploration, curiosity, wonder, and peace. So I'm going to use one of my projects, Ancestral Archives, as a reference point and a gateway to this topic, but I'm going to quickly unpack what I mean by cyborgian, since there are a lot of definitions. When I say cyborgian art forms, I'm referencing the cyclical nature of humans and technology. So humans create technology, and then technology recreates humans. So this process of creating and reshaping via technology is something that I'm very interested in exploring through art. So that being said, Ancestral Archives is an XR experience that highlights a collection of chatbots that are modeled and inspired by historically significant radical Black thought leaders. So specifically the written works of Audre Lorde, James Baldwin, Octavia Butler, and Zora Neale Hurston. So you can see the avatar designs, each one respectively. So I started this project with a simple question: what would happen? What kind of experience would occur if AI models were informed solely by Black radical thought and counterculture? And so at first I was just curious about how these chatbots would respond when the only way that they could understand themselves, the world, and its relation to things was through this corpus of Black thought. And I want to highlight very quickly that the archive is not the chatbots, it's not the people, the archive is the data set themselves. So the archive it's the fundamental embedding of the counterculture. So next I started to think about the culture around chatbots, as well as our relationship with them in society with this type of technology. So when we think about the traditional applications of chatbots, it's very transactional and very information retrieval based. So take the more popular chatbots right now. So ChatGPT, write my paper for me, tell me about XYZ, or Siri, tell me the weather. So I wanted to know, like, how can we, part of my exploration is investigating how we can encourage more intimacy and fluidity and explorative interactions with this technology, and how can we redefine in that vein the expectations that we have when using this technology. So again, part of my practice is creating VR experiences, and this project, Ancestral Archives, was also an immersive experience. And I found that through my practice, that VR, while immersive, it's also isolating. So it disconnects individuals from one, the physical space, two, their bodies, and three, from their community, from the other people in the installation space. So I wanted to create and explore different ways to share digital experiences, to have shared digital experiences rather, that are still immersive, but allow us to be connected to our bodies and to people in the space. So to do that, for clarity, I guess I'm going to break down the project into two different categories, the digital and physical components, and then talk about each. So this is the AI models. So referring back to the first two questions of what kind of experience could manifest if AI models were informed solely by Black radical thought, and then how could we create digital experiences that are generative and restorative instead of transactional and extractive. I wanted to focus on challenging the ways that individuals interact with this type of technology, as I stated prior. And I already knew that I could train an AI model to sound or say sound a specific way or say a specific thing. And I also I knew I did not want to train these models to speak like the associated authors and add to this process of Black zombification, exploitation, and this overall disregard for the data rights of dead individuals. So instead, I decided to set no parameters for the chatbots when it came to saying something syntactically correct, grammatically correct, or contextually relevant. And as you can see through this kind of conversation between the chatbots trained, this is the chatbot trained on Audre Lorde's writing and then as well as James Baldwin's writing, that this decision allowed for somewhat poetic and abstracted responses with some repetition of certain words and letters. And it was through the observation of these responses that I began to realize I was fostering a more intimate relationship between the chatbots I was creating and myself, where I, as the human, I had to apply meaning to the responses. So now it gave me the response and I have to do work. I'm not getting information, I'm getting something that I have to now apply meaning to. And so again, this is more of the virtual environment and the kind of the digitality of creating a virtual environment that houses these AI bots or these AI models. So given the way that chatbots are responding in somewhat poetic fashion, I began to refer to the chatbots as virtual poets, not because they create poetry necessarily, but because their responses are abstracted and sometimes require applied meaning from the reader. So I wanted to create distance from what people normally think about chatbots and how they're used to interacting with it, which is why I then ended up trying to create some of that distance through the language I was using to even describe them, especially since I intentionally designed these chatbots to be the opposite of those. So, sorry, this here is just the physical, it's like a walkthrough of the digital environment. So you guys can kind of get a little idea of what it looked like. And so physical components and then the engagement. So engagement is really how people were interacting with the space. This is a physical map of the installation space. where I've indicated where each of the experiences were with the ABC labels, and the physical components is where I really try to unpack the third question of how we can have immersive experiences that connect us to physically to our bodies and other people in the space. So this was the first experience. People would interact with virtual poets in a very familiar way. I found that people found this experience to be more approachable, and they had no issues engaging with people. It was almost too familiar for people. The second experience, which was a video wall, depicted a fire pit and a couple of stools. This is actually the part that got the most engagement, since the digital wall itself it's a digital representation of the physical space in the installation. So everyone in the installation is represented by a green orb, and as more people entered the space, the fire would grow larger and more virtual poets would come to convene around the fire pit. And so body tracking was used to also track the proximity of individuals to each other in the space. So as people were engaging and playing with each other in the space, the orbs themselves would become larger and begin to spark. And so with this experience, I found that most people felt comfortable to play, to be curious, while subtly understanding that them being there in that space with these people is having an effect on the virtual environment. And so that was very successful, in my opinion. So they were connected to the physical space and the people in that space and to the digital environment simultaneously. So the third and final experience was a parabolic video screen, which housed the XR experience. The entire experience was controlled by an iPad that people would move forward or backward or left or right to kind of walk through the space. And I found that this was so foreign to people that it almost acted like a gatekeeper to a deeper experience. They were charmed overall by the visuals, but it was almost too foreign, causing them to disengage, which was very interesting. The entire point of it was to be more engaging. So all that being said, wrapping up, I honestly don't have a formal or neat conclusion, since this is very much so still an ongoing exploration, but I've been, when it comes to some thoughts that I've had through this process, is just how intensely important the balance of the digital and the physical is. As a digital artist, I focus a lot on the digitality of things, but then becoming somebody who is presenting this work in an installation space, I've realized that creating and cultivating a space that encourages these qualities of playfulness, curiosity, is the first step to having people feel open enough to engage at all. And I also found it quite effective to work with technology that people already have some foundational understanding of, and then kind of flipping or challenging the notion of the application or the familiarity of it via the experience. So thank you for listening, and that is it.
Thank you so much for that. And thank you to all of the panelists. I think we're going to transition a bit to the Q&A portion of our event here. So please continue to bring those questions to the Q&A. And looks like I will go ahead and start asking questions here. Again, the floor is open for additional questions, and we will do our best to get those answers to you. I'm going to start with Brianna and or Kyle. We have someone who's listed as anonymous here, who asked that they thought the words enduring and function were very interesting in each of the talks. They are curious how either or both of you see Black content creation more broadly as a liberatory tool in an oppressive media landscape. And they think that the conversation between the two of you would be very interesting.
Thank you for that question. I think that's a fantastic question. So in terms of my use of the word function, I think that is symbolic kind of the way that my research interests have shifted, because like I said, initially I was like really focused on thinking about like whether or not, like how Black of a podcast something is, and like trying to determine the characteristics of a Black podcast, whether that be like whether the hosts identify as Black, if they outwardly identify that their audience is specifically Black. And I've kind of moved away from that, because I think that I do that has its usage too, but I think that the questions around, so like what does it do, was more important to me. And so thinking about the function, I think that podcasts have served as a space for marginalized people to speak back. So kind of talking back to Kyle's presentation, it's a space for them to speak back, especially within spaces where they don't have the opportunity to do so. And to also focus on areas that we don't normally see in mainstream media. So a lot of the stories that were told on the Girl Check podcast, I was not familiar with at all. And it was really fascinating to learn those different stories. And so I think that that's an example of taking narratives that have either been buried or just not presented at all and putting them on a platform so that more people can have access to them.
Yeah, I don't take it back as well. Thank you for starting us off, Dr. Barner. I really appreciate it. Yeah, and I think that the term injure came from me because I think something I'm identifying in like a lot of the commentary around sort of like the Shane Dawson situation, similar situation, is that like a lot of people watching these YouTube videos with all the sort of like racist, sexist, homophobic content, that they feel like a responsibility sort of like to stick to with their favorite creator, because like maybe they'll learn and progress and evolve. Like, but something that Cat Black sort of like says outwardly in the video that I referenced in my presentation, sort of like, you actually don't have to endure anything. You can actually choose to sort of like find something you actually like to watch. It's not going to make you feel bad or feel sick. It's a thing that like there's like an interesting way we have to remind audiences that they're not like receptors, just like receivers of content. You can actually choose sort of like how to, so like you have a say in like how the how sort of the culture you're involved in is involved in, sort of like what the rules are, what the standards are, and all of those wonderful wonderful things. Like it's like a interesting harkening back sort of like a 90s of Black media studies where everyone's sort of like we're sort of like very similar to Dr. Barner's talk of like everyone figured out in the 90s like Black people watch movies, wow, and they have their own tastes. That's interesting. And I also think like I don't like as a liberatory tool right now, I don't know if the platforms I'm talking about are liberatory tools, but I think to go back again to Dr. Barner's talk about like I think the content creators, particularly the Black YouTubers I'm talking about in my chapter, I think that they are setting the precedent for what it can mean sort of to set boundaries, to ask audiences to demand more and sort of like have sort of digital consumption practices that sort of prioritize their sanity. Like there's something to be said about a critical mass of folks like encouraging sort of like a more like sort of like an audience that feel like they're not allowed to just take whatever they want. I think I'll just stop talking there. But yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much for this question, Anonymous. And thank you so much for being in conversation with my work, Dr. Barner. I really appreciate it.
Okay, we'll transition to the next question here. We have a question from David, who's asking Anna, what for you is the purpose of shame? That is about the reduplicate, is it about the reduplication of power? And if so, what is the relationship between arts practice and shame?
That's an excellent question. I kind of briefly perused the questions earlier and I was like struck by like, whoa, my instinct is like, wow, I have no idea. And I think, so I can, because that is such a difficult question to answer, but I think a couple things come to mind. I think about Brene Brown's idea about shame and vulnerability and like kind of psychology, which is like the difference between guilt and shame, and maybe a more generous reading of like why evolutionarily even or societally, how is it even useful? Like, why does it even happen? And I think for guilt, it's about your actions. You've done something wrong and kind of feeling bad about it. The kind of shift to shame is about this kind of deeply existential sense of worthlessness, about being not just what you've done, but who you are. And I think that gets to the way it's used, which is maybe more what the question was about. And I think it's a way to definitely enact control and punishment, but it's especially useful, like even more useful than guilt or fear, in that it's once you've implanted it in someone, they will do the rest of the work for you, like ongoing. And I think also because it's about who you are rather than what you've done, it is such a like sinister kind of form of policing like identity, because it is about who you are in this like deep-seated way. And as far as its relation to art, I think art practice as a way to kind of address shame is uniquely positioned as compared to like maybe like more theoretical or cerebral kind of talking about it, writing about it, in that a lot of art is about putting yourself on the line and being really vulnerable in a way which might even seem inappropriate in other, arenas. And I think being and that's where the key relationship between vulnerability and shame is so key. The more vulnerable you can be, the more effective at like, undoing the shame or like bringing it to light. And I think that kind of really personal stakes and kind of almost extremity that we might associate with some like avant-garde art is like very useful for kind of really tackling shame in a way that maybe like therapy or analysis is not able to go that far.
Thank you for that. I believe this next question is aimed at Raquel. It's an anonymous participant here who is curious or concerned about the lack of a second party for accountability in RR. As someone who has used eating and activity recording to stay in an ED space, they're hoping that you can kind of expand or expound about on that a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much for the question. I also think that that's curious and concerning. There's not a lot of research in any field, at least as far as I know, on the recovery records app functionality, how similar it is to dieting apps, but also how similar it is to so-called pro-ED, pro-ANA spaces where users record their meals or their weight or whatever it is, and for sort of community based on that or involving that. And I should also note that although this isn't the focus of my project, it does happen where even though Recovery Record as an app is primarily interested in just you, the user, and the app, you do have an option to involve like a clinician or a therapist with it, and like they can get a paid version to like sort of continuously monitor your app input behavior so that they can review it with you in like a therapy session, for example. But that version of the app or that process that does involve somebody who's like an in-person or just a human treatment team doesn't change that recovery record, for example, sells your data or things like that. So that is definitely something I'm really interested in exploring further, whether it be, although like I haven't found any other research on it yet, I think that it's kind of super crucial for thinking about what exactly it means for people to be using this app to recover from or treat an eating disorder, or to just imagine what it means to be somebody with an eating disorder. So yeah, I hope that expands upon it a little bit. Thank you so much.
Try to give you all a little bit of a mental break in between questions here. So I'm going to go to Josie and ask from Morgan, what was the sonic experience like? Was there music? Was it all silence? If you could explain that a little bit.
Yeah, so no, it was not silent. My friend designed an original score for that exhibition. So the primary sounds were these talking drums, followed by some very soft synth noises and some like natural sounds. So like bird sounds, water sounds, fire sounds. So crackling fire sounds, stuff like that. So you would kind of hear all of that while you were in the exhibition. Thank you for the question.
Thank you for that. So Diana, could you say more about your creative process and thinking process? It's very interesting how you mediated your experience at each step, vintage videos, mediated by the metaphor of eating, mediated by the painting of multiple screenshots. Do you see these mediations as iterative moments in a single creative series, or as a branching pathways, or something else?
That's a great question. Thank you for the question. I think actually I'll borrow from Brianna's talk, and when she references alchemy, I think that sometimes, especially with certain like old school analog processes like painting, where there's something kind of magical that I can't quite explain when I try and render something, and it's happening in my eyes, it's happening in my hands. And I think every time I kind of do a new version or remediate it, it is this kind of like almost like a sorcery, kind of like trying to see what happens anew, what can be like uncovered or revealed anew from this new version, and kind of like transfiguration of the idea or the body. And I think I like both ideas. So it's iterative in that every time I'm trying to get something new, but it's also branching off in that every time I do it, it gives me kind of answers to certain questions, but it opens new questions, which leads me down another path. So I think that, yeah, it's a physical embodied way for me to like process these ideas, in this like subconscious way. Yeah, hope that answers it.
Thank you, thank you. Josie, this next question is for you. Patricia asks, wants to hear a little bit more about the created digital spaces. They're curious about the underlying technology, if you can go into that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. So I created this, the virtual environment in collaboration with the EY Metaverse Lab. And in general, it's built off on Unity. I am using Python for sorry, that's not the virtual environment, and in general, the island is shaped like fashioned after the Sankofa bird, which is why it's called Sankofa Island. And it's a bird that symbolizes returning, remembering, but you're in a different position when you do. So it's returning, but you're evolved at the same time. And then there's 4 locations on the island: a fire pit, a beach area, a smoking huts, and then a garden. And each of the virtual poets would be in one of these locations based off of, because I also attributed elemental qualities to the mask. So for example, based off of the kind of the sentiments and emotions that I felt while reading the authors. So for example, Audrey, very fiery, very warrior type energy. So I gave her the element of fire. Zora, very fluid, very very adaptable, always talking about the spirituality and kind of the in-between. So I attributed her water. So you kind of see these kind of ties elementally, and that would be, I just gave you kind of an overall, hopefully an okay picture visually of what the island would look like. But technically it was just built in Unity.
That's so fascinating. Next question will be for Deanna. Juan says that he's fascinated by your piece, Consumed. If you could say more about your portrayals of the Asian face function in your art practice. He noticed that in your multi-layer projections of screen, body, bed, performance, there seems to be something about the face that is arresting. That is, the face is the site of pleasure, feeling, registered sensation, eating, consuming, it's the object of the gaze, etc. And you focus on painting the mediated face as well. Is there something about the face that also relates to how you are thinking of the interface as racialized modes of difference?
Thank you for that question. I think my first thought is that the face is linked to ideas of shame, and then also more like almost mythically in like the Disney movie Mulan, like the idea of like dishonoring your family and this inherited kind of burden or trauma, intergenerational trauma, and the more in Chinese, language, and the idea of like losing face is literally about this relation to, your ability to look someone in the eye, to look up. And I think also when the face is kind of like obscured, it creates this kind of dehumanized relation, especially in like pornography or something like that. So I think exposing the face or focusing on the face is about kind of looking for that vulnerability in spite of the shame, and kind of undoing that shame and giving the kind of permission to look up and literally get the face back.
I'm going to give this compliment to Raquel on behalf of one of our anonymous participants here, but they said thank you for your answer, and they definitely got the pro Anna vibe and appreciate that you recognize that. So it's important to acknowledge that. The next question will be for Josie from our own Lisa Nakamura, who would love to hear more about your decision not to use Audre Lorde's words when creating the chatbot. That kind of chatbot would be so popular given the interest in her work. Your Black poets powered by AI in some ways frustrate viewers' desires to enjoy the parts of radical Black feminism that they want to see. Is there a legitimate use for Lorde's avatar or other Black poets to give audiences access to the work? And she says that this is a wonderful multidimensional project, by the way.
Well, thank you for that. So I guess I'm a little confused by the question, because her work is used, her words are used as data. The only thing that I don't find interest in, nor do I, maybe that is the frustrating part, is making the chatbots try and sound like her or them. I don't think it's morally, I just didn't feel right trying to do that. And there's a lot of ethical issues, kind of like I was saying before, where the exploitation, Black zombification, and then just all these things I wasn't really the point of my exploration. But the archive itself is like are from her written works. So, and I actually, for the first part of the exhibition, for the chatbots on the computer and the monitors, on the monitor and the keyboards, I have a QR code also associated with that then lists all of the works that are used as data, so that people can then, and also, kind of overall blurb about who this is and how they live their life and what they should be acknowledged for in this exhibition. So I did want to give people a way, almost like a gateway to, if they want to do their own exploration, they can do that. But I did not want to try and make it like, oh yeah, like I'm about to talk to Audre Lorde or James Baldwin right now. It felt very intrusive and violating to these individuals that have already given us so much. And so, yeah, I think I answered your question. I'm hoping. I also want to highlight the distinction between, I'm not recreating these people in any way. That was never my intentions. It was simply to create an entity that is the only way they can interact with you is by using the words of these Black radical thought leaders, right? So they're not pulling out full sentences. They're more like pulling out maybe like a couplet and then like piecing it with another couplet and then piecing it with another couplet and then sending it off to you. I found that a little bit more interesting than just kind of trying to get it to say exactly, there was already an Audre Lorde, there was already a James Baldwin. I don't need to create that version 2.0, even if I could. Yeah.
Thank you. Before we get to this one question, I'm gonna use my kind of privilege here to interject my own question here. So working with the Preach Lab and our co-PI here, Andre Brock, CTDA is something that is at the core of how we're going about the business here. I was hoping I could get, Raquel, if I could get you to talk a little bit around your kind of interpretations of how are you using this in your project a little bit more. It's in the ways and the scholarship that I've seen CTDA work, this project is pretty unique.
Thank you so much for asking. I think that CTDA is something that I find like super animating and exciting. So I really love working with that analytic process. For me, I guess the starting point base level for it is like, I'm not just interested in looking at, when you have the app open, what does that log screen ask you to provide? And kind of analyzing the rhetoric within that log entry prompt, or like what the actual app design, so like the colors, the images, whatever is like on that user interface. I'm also interested in the different layers of recovery record. So for example, I think that CTTA is something that's sort of like guiding me and pointing towards it. I don't know if I've quite reached it yet, but it's definitely something I aim to do, or that's my ambition. And so part of how I'm imagining myself or trying to get at that is like thinking instead of just that user interface, I'm interested in, so because you have a recovery record, for example, downloaded on your phone, what does that mean for the types of ads you see on YouTube elsewhere? What does that mean, like, if you're simultaneously using multiple ED recovery apps, or using an ED app and a diet app, or you're on social media posting about weight loss or weight gain, and on that point too, I'm also interested in the life of eating disorders and diet culture and active fatness and ableism and white supremacist food and culture norms in the digital sphere beyond just one particular app, and to not treat the app or eating disorder diagnostic practices or things like that, or treatment protocols, as isolated from that mess of, I guess, diet culture, white supremacy, ableism, stuff like that. And so I'm trying to use it in the sense of thinking through recovery record, not just as an isolated app or one specific place where one user says what they have for breakfast, lunch, and dinner each day, but instead thinking about it in this kind of wider problematic or difficult ecosystem, especially since what eating disorders are, or like eating disorder as a huge diagnostic category, is, at least to my thinking, already insufficient and generalizing in the context of, like I said earlier, like white supremacist food and body norms and ableism and things like that. So I hope that answers the question, but essentially I'm just trying to approach it in as layered as a way as possible and get beyond the bounds of recovery record, because I think that's relevant to how recovery record works and what it is and who it's built for, who its imagined user is.
No, thank you for that. I think after this event, I think I need to put you in conversation with our lab and some of the future kind of thinking and programming that we have for sure. We have two more questions before we wrap up here. The next question from an anonymous user here is for Josie. What connection do you see between traditional concepts of the spirit world with our present use of digital and hybrid spaces? Is there any transcendent meaning-making role that you imagine in the reanimation of these poets, storytellers, and creators?
So yeah, like I'm all about the connection or building connections between the spiritual and the technical worlds that we live in. That's also kind of where I love to sit. I do see similarities when we think of conceptually, because not realistically, but when we think about interconnectivity or the interconnection that happens through technology, and then what happens in spirituality or in the spirit world, you're connected to something larger than yourself. And then this idea of interdependence, where we are kind of all relying or all kind of linked together, our well-being or like what we say, what we do is always linked together in our society. And then I forget the last question. It was the role, the mean making of something. The mean making of, if you could help me out a little bit.
Is there any transcendent meaning making role that you imagine in the reanimation of these poets, storytellers, and creators?
So again, reanimation is not necessarily what I'm doing, but I do see something. The entire reason why I ended up using these data, like, these Black thought leaders as the data, the writings from them as the data set, is because I noticed just an intense lack of that type of narrative, whether it's Black, femme, queer centered narratives in the data sets that were being used to train popular models at the time. It'd be a lot of Western literature, a lot of white culture centered literature. So I find that, if anything, the two key takeaways from this installation, from this work that I have is, or I would like to share with other people, is just kind of questioning what type of data is fundamentally being used for these data sets, and how can we really challenge the idea of what is valuable for a chatbot to know in its data set, or for it to, what literature and what written works are considered valuable. And then as well as this idea of how can we have a more generative relationship with these type of technologies and less transactional. And I just hope that through this work, people kind of have those questions floating around their head, like, oh, maybe I can make a data set just purely off of this now, and let me use that. And I'm also open sourcing all the data sets so people can use them if they so choose. Yeah.
Okay, last question for the day. This is for Raquel. This comes from the postdocs for Disco, affectionately call him our fearless leader, Jeff Nagy. He's asking about the specificity of ED in relation to a nexus of diagnosis, disability, and technological treatment. How have you seen the kinds of technologies you've been researching differ from other app-enabled CBT treatments? Do they give rise to a different kind of subjectivities, or have a different relationship to treatment or cure, or to embodiment, or tie into different kinds of cultural histories or imaginaries?
Thank you so much for that question. So I guess just kind of start off, like, what I've read on EDs in kind of psych realm, but also in the digital realm, so digital health industry realm, they aren't often approached as disability or in relation to disability or madness. And so I'm really interested in making that connection. And I think that fundamentally changes how one approaches and understands study of EDs. And so I think that research on different types of mental health related apps and CBT based apps has really informed my thinking on Recovery Record in particular. And I think that like something that differs with this ED app in particular, or ED apps more generally compared to other CBT based apps, at least as far as I know, my thinking so far is ED apps that are based on self-monitoring and meal logs, which a number of them are, just as in-person non-app treatment protocols usually are, require you to, they're kind of like continuously disruptive to your day, or they require sort of routine practice. So every time you eat, you're supposed to log that into the app, whether it's a snack or meal or whatever, in a different way than, at least I imagine, if you were using a mood tracker or something like that for depression, for example. There are different demands or different ways that those types of apps structure your day-to-day life. And also because you're continuously being asked not just what you ate, but like how you feel about your body in the moment or who you're with or things like that. I'm really interested in the idea of how using Recovery Record or ED apps generally changes how you imagine your body and how you imagine your relationship, the relationship between your body and your food, and also how you imagine food in a more cultural sense or a social setting. So I think that there's something about our bodies and embodiment, and there's something about food and culture and sociality that I think necessarily makes Recovery Record or ED apps different than other CBT-based apps, even though they might use similar self-monitoring practices. I think that there's something really interesting, at least to me, about what an ED app does to you and how you imagine yourself if it's folded into your life in that way. And also, I guess, to the last point, I think a lot about how ED diagnostics, like what it means to understand yourself as somebody with an ED, and within an ED, that's a huge broad term that a bunch of different things are nested under, but also a lot of other things are folded into the category of EDs that might not necessarily be there, or aren't as well known as the common, like, I guess, anorexia, binge eating disorder, bulimia, things like that. So I'm really interested in like the history of where that diagnostic category comes from. And that's where a lot of my sort of gendered analysis comes into, because a lot of ED research, whether it's about digital stuff or historical stuff in the past, or like how to improve treatment protocols, has to do with gender and has to do with how we imagine who exactly is allowed to have EDs is often white cis women who are of a certain class level, things like that. And so I guess this is sort of just nodding that, yes, I think all your questions are very interesting. I'm trying to explore those and think about those further, but thank you so much for asking them.
So with that being said, to Brianna, Raquel, Kyle, Diana, and Josie, I want to thank you for your presentations. This has been really, really thought-provoking for us. I want to thank Evan and Kristen for their work behind the scenes and making this work. To the PIs, co-PIs of the Disco Network, thank you. And to the Mellon Foundation, thank you so much for being here. And to our audience, thank you for being here and being in community with us. Please stay in touch with us. There's opportunities to join us for future events, and we look forward to furthering our community with you. So thank you so much. Thank you.